Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Memetic Theory 101 session. I am Adam, and I am a writer at the Raven Foundation. And I am here so happy with my friend Wolfgang Palaver. Wolfgang is the author of Rene Girard's Mimetic Theory, and Wolfgang is also professor of Catholic social thought and chair of the Institute for Systematic Theology at the University of Innsbruck. And Wolfgang, thank you so much for doing this series of videos with us.
Thank you for inviting me, and my time as a chair is already a reference to the past. So I'm
Oh,
now
goodness.
yeah.
I was reading off of your book. You are no longer chair of systematic theology.
I'm just a professor, teacher, and researcher, and have more time to do an interview like the one we do now, or write some more pieces on mimetic theory. So that's a good thing.
Yes, that's an excellent thing. And the book is also of the past, and you have you're working on another book.
Yeah, there is a book. Actually, it was approved 2 days ago. It will come out in fall, and it's a very important but much smaller book on the distinction between the sacred and the holy, or the sacred and saintliness. And this is so key to the understanding, to the proper understanding of mimetic theory, that I spent really about 2 years to work on this small book. And I even was benefiting from the lockdown, because I revised it in March and April substantially and extensively. And I think it's now a very round and sound development of this distinction that was made in Girard's last book.
Mm.
But you can find already glimpses of this important distinction in the earlier books. And you can go back to the history of French thinking on religion. And that was very exciting to do that. So actually the revision came out of a movie I saw on the Dreyfus case. And this movie was so striking for me that I went deeper into the history of the Dreyfus case, and also the offsprings and developments. And then I saw that there is a deep connection to mimetic theory, and also his own biography. His father was a Dreyfusiard, and his mother was Catholic. And those two sides were in confrontation during this area. But there was an exceptional Dreyfusiard who was Catholic, socialist, and Dreyfusiard. This was the famous Catholic writer Charles Péguy.
Mm.
And in some way, in one of the interviews, Rene referred to that there is this double religion in his upbringing. And he didn't know about Péguy for a very long time, but it's very important to look at Péguy, Bergson, and then you see where this distinction between the sacred and the holy comes from. And that's what my new book is all about. And it took a long time, the revision and all the things, but just 2 days ago, I got the final yes from Cambridge University Press, saying to me the revised version will go into production with any more revisions or work except copy editing. So I'm very glad since 2 days.
That's fantastic. Do you know when it's going to come out?
No, not yet. So they
Okay.
will contact me, and hopefully I expect it in fall, because it's not a large book, and they do it as an ebook and a printed version. So it's a series especially for ebooks that many universities have subscribed to. So I actually want to teach with the doctoral students beginning in October a course on this new book. So I will do everything that it's there on the 1st of October.
Fantastic. And we'll get more into the sacred and the holy, I'm sure, either in section, well, when we talk about sacrifice, or maybe when we talk about the revealed religions. So stay tuned for that. That'll be in either video 3 or video 4. But before we get there, Wolfgang, I thought you might introduce more of yourself and how you got into or interested in mimetic theory.
I think there are two reasons. I mean, one never knows really what are the reasons why one gets interested in a certain theory and a certain way of thinking. But when I reflected on that question and asked myself what were the reasons, what is the background that draw me to Girard's mimetic theory, I think there are two. And the first is already during my time at school, I was very interested in anthropological literature. I mean, not the highly sophisticated version, but travel literature to the Amazonian rainforest, to Austrian people who traveled to Tibet and described other cultures, other religions. I was eagerly reading that when I was in high school. And at one occasion, I even thought I myself want to become an anthropologist in the sense of a field worker, to go to these remote places and also study those cultures and so on. And Austria is not a colonial, Austria today it's a tiny little country, but in former times it was an empire. But it was never a colonial empire in a bigger sense. We have nearly no sea and so on. So if you are not growing up, or we're not growing up in a colonial power, there is no ethnologist or anthropologist tradition like in France or in Germany to some degree, or especially also in Great Britain. So all my relatives who didn't study and they were not connected to any university, they said, I mean, this is no way to go, because you will not make money. So I stopped to do that. And much later, I realized when I was really reading Violence and the Sacred and studying Girard, that I'm really doing now anthropological work, in the sense I had a leaning already in high school. So that's the first reason. The second reason is also in the last years of high school, that was in the end of 70s, I became involved in Catholic youth movement, and also at that time in the peace movement, that was connected to the Pershing II demonstrations in Germany, but also in Austria. So I became a peacenik, a member of the peace movement from the Catholic branch. And that was the reason for me to study theology, because my high school was a special technical school on electronics and communicational engineering. So I was rather going into a technical direction, but because of my involvement in peace movement, I turned to theology. So the peace movement brought me into theology, and when I started to study theology, I immediately, or quite soon, I came across Raimund Schwager, who was teaching, a Jesuit, who was teaching dogmatics at the University of Innsbruck. And I started studying in 79, and he published just a year before his book, Must There Be Scapegoats? So there was all over the place talk about this book and Girard's mimetic theory, and I was quickly deeply involved in that. And I'm still, I entered this world, and I'm still deeply involved in it, and still try to work in this field and try to understand it better. So those two reasons, I think, are the most important if one wants to understand. Maybe also I was an eager reader of literature. Also during high school, and still I very much like to read literature. So a theory that has such a close connection to literature is also something that was very attractive for me.
Yeah. when we talk about mimetic theory as a theory, it often stays up in the theoretical realm, but mimetic theory has so much personal wealth to it in our lives. What about mimetic theory has influenced you, I guess, on a personal level?
I think from the very beginning, I was also attracted in an existential way, because it helped me also to understand some weird experiences, one's own envious emotions and so on. You know, you have a very good friend at school, and when he gets a bad degree, you sometimes have a feeling of satisfaction, and you think, this is really strange. And then you come across this theory and cross literature that explains you suddenly this is not something completely weird. That's something many of us experience, and we have now a plausible explanation for it. So I think there is also an existential longing in myself, and I remember in 91, 92, I spent the whole year at Stanford University and had a lot of research seminars with René Girard. And at one occasion, we were in a house of a friend who invited a couple of a group of Girardians and himself. And René suddenly said, Wolfgang is an existentialist. I never thought about myself in that way, but probably there is something existential. So I always had troubles with theory, also theologies and so on, who are completely abstract. So I always want to feel the things, to know what does it mean for my own life. Also, what does it mean for the political life, for society. So I never was really attracted by thought for thought, just for thought, but always, what does it mean for me? I have to feel it.
Yes.
I have to feel a theory. And the more I feel it, the more I become interested and attracted, and keep on diving deeper into it.
Well, it's one of the reasons that I love your book so much, is because you do dive into real life historical examples, American history and world history and myths and stories. And so that's one of the ways that you make mimetic theory come alive for me, is bringing in these real life situations. So another plug for Wolfgang's fantastic book. So, so go get the book. Can you tell us a little bit about René Girard's life, and maybe how he always says that he didn't discover mimetic theory, but he kind of stumbled across it. So could you do a little biographical sketch for us for who René Girard was?
Yeah, I mean, he was born in France, in Avignon, in the south of France, and his mother was a devout Catholic. His father was a quite important cultural person in Avignon, so he was head of two very important museums for a very long time, the Musée Calvé, and later on also for the Papal Palace. His father was anti-clerical and a Dreyfusiat, so more the socialist anti-clerical leaning. So that's the background. And last year I spent about 2 weeks in the neighborhood of Avignon, actually 1 week teaching American students Memetic theory. And it was just a great thing to do it in that area. And I went several times to the town of Avignon, and you can buy books there from Girard's father. So there is a book about the history of Avignon that is still there in bookstores, and also a history of the Musée Calvé, where he was working for decades. So he was an important local, culturally important figure. So that's the background of René. Of course, we should not forget the time he was raised, because when he later on studied at the École des Chartes, like his father, in medieval paleography in Paris, that was during the war. and it was difficult to live in Paris, and for very often Gerard studied at home and was in Avignon. And after the war in 1947, he went to the United States. So sometimes he said, I could have just followed my father because he had the same education and become a curator in a museum. But maybe that was a little bit too boring for him. So he got the offer to teach French in an American university. He went to Indiana and became an instructor for French. But then soon at this university, later also in other universities, he became also a teacher of literature, French literature, but then also Dostoevsky, Stendhal, Proust, Cervantes. So he liked to read. And then he started to teach those books of the great novelists. And by teaching these great novelists and reading them eagerly, and he sometimes says he was only a week ahead of his students, he suddenly discovered that's not so important to focus on the distinctions between all those great novelists, but to see what they have in common. And by looking at that, he more and more discovered what he later on called mimetic desire, so that human beings are not desiring autonomously out of their own, but most of the time we desire objects and aim at goals that we borrow from the other.
Yes, and Gerard's work is often described with three major works that he wrote: Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, Violence and the Sacred, and Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. Are these like the three like fundamental books, would you say, or are there more books that I mean, clearly he wrote like 11 books or something like that.
Yeah. But those three books are seminal books in the sense that the three most important insights of mimetic theory are closely related to each of those three books. So I just, let me make another advertisement. I just published, and it came out yesterday, a bibliography of Gerard and mimetic theory in the Oxford Bibliographies. And this was really hard work. I did it in fall and partly this spring. And my bibliography covers now 120 books or articles. Most of them are books. And so I also structured, when I focused on the main books, the key texts of René Girard, on those three books. So Deceit, Desire, and the Novel is the book that introduces us into what he calls mimetic desire. He called it in that book mediation, but later on it's this type of desire that's not the desire of going from the subject to the object, but going to the object, choosing the object in the sense of borrowed desire, so desiring according to the other. That's the first book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. And this book is a book focusing on Cervantes, Stendhal, Flaubert, Dostoevsky, and Marcel Proust. And it's a tremendous book. And when I started to study it and read it, I also read the novels that are discussed in this book. So that took me a couple of years, but it was a great time to read this literature, because Dostoevsky, Proust, all those five authors are just extraordinary people who had deep insights into human life and human beings. And so this book is the outcome of this close reading of these novelists. But it's also, and I felt it immediately, but today I can even explain it more in a reflectory manner. It's a deeply spiritual book, because this book is in some way also mirroring René Girard's own conversion when he was about 40 or a little bit more. when he was writing the conclusion of this book, he was also indirectly describing his own conversion, because after childhood he followed more the anti-clerical, anti-religious path of his father. But this book, The City Sign, the novel, shows that all the great novelists underwent some way of also a conversion. So they first were egoistic people, full of pride and self enhancement in a bad way. And the masterpieces of them all are self-critical. So the conversion is seeing how they were full of pride, how they were just following fashion, were entangled in mimetic rivalries and so on. And the more they could overcome their prideful egos, the more they were able to write those masterpieces that bring out these tendencies in human life. And something similar happened in René Girard's life. And so he got remarried in Catholic rites, and he baptized his children when they were already a couple of years old. And so this book is tremendous. And I remember on one occasion where I was so completely taken by the existential spiritual dimension. I was frequently meeting a friend of mine. She was studying political science, and I have still a leaning or a little envy of political science, because they are more important than theologians, and I knew the department, and I also took courses at that time. So, but she studied it, and sometimes we were at lunch, and then we chatted about this department and the rumors and all. We talked in a loose and bad way about the failures and weaknesses of the professors in political science. And just on one occasion, I have just read a chapter in The City Sign, the novel, where René Girard shows so convincingly that the people who are not full of pride at all, and this is in Marcel Proust's, one of the parts of his novel, is the grandmother. And so she does not realize and now the term what is the type the type full of pride who is so superficial.
I should
the
grab
snob,
probably, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, there is a snob in this obvious snob in this novel, and the only person who does not realize that he's a snob is the grandmother, who is not snobbish at all. So therefore, you only see the failings and the weaknesses of others the more you are yourself in that direction. So when I met my friend again a week later, a couple of days later, she was astonished that I was not eager to do our usual chattering, because I just felt if I now spend an hour or so on the weaknesses of others, I've just not realized what I read the last day. So this is a book, if you read it carefully and eagerly, it questions yourself and makes you rethink some of your own behaviors. So this is a tremendous book, and I think it's a spiritual masterpiece. It's not on the surface, not a religious book at all. The first thinker who really praised that book and made it an exceptional book was a professor of sociology of literature. Actually, the first one who got a chair for the sociology of literature was Lucien Goldman. And he was establishing an institute for the sociology of literature in Brussels. And there's a famous inaugural lecture that he gave, and is part of his famous book, I think The Theory of the Novel or something like that. And in his book, in his inaugural lecture, he says, my Institute of Sociology of Religion is based on three thinkers. And he was a Marxist sociologist of religion. This institute is based on Karl Marx. This institute is based on Georges Lukács, who was a famous literary thinker from a Marxist tradition. And the third one was René Girard, he mentioned. And René Girard was at that time, I think, not yet 50 and has published one book. So the Marxist professor of sociology of literature praised this book, which is a tremendous book, for reasons that are true, but it's much more important because it's not just a sociological analysis close to a profound Marxist reading. No, it's a deeply Christian spiritual book if you look a little bit more closely into it.
Fascinating. And the two other books are Violence in the Sacred and Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. And go ahead.
Violence in the Sacred is the second book, and this is very different in some way. And it took René Girard 12 years to publish that book. So there's a long time. And first he wanted to give a whole theory of biblical religions and early religions. He calls them archaic religions, but I use now more and more the term early religions because that's a more proper understanding and also compatible with newer research. And Violence in the Sacred is now the result of his eager studying of anthropological literature, of Claude Lévi-Strauss, of Sigmund Freud, of all those theories who try to understand the emergence and the development. My dean just called me. Can we stop for 5 minutes or just that I just...
Yes.
Can we stop for 5 minutes?
Yeah. Hey, everyone, we're back. And Wolfgang, thank you for that description of Violence in the Sacred. Can you briefly describe Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World?
Yeah, originally, René Girard wanted to write a book about the importance of religion in the foundation of culture and do it in a comprehensive way. So talking about early religions of the early stages of humanity, and at the same time, what he also discovered, the biblical difference that he discovered in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. But after about 10 years, he saw he cannot bring it together in one book. So Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, that came out 6 years after Violence and the Sacred in the original French version, is now the first book that introduces us into the biblical difference that is so important for sure.
Excellent. And we are going to get much more into that in our fourth video coming up when we talk about biblical revelation and Christianity. But Wolfgang, thank you so much for this introduction, and thank you everyone for watching, and stay tuned for our next video when we get more into the function of desire. Okay, so we'll quickly break there, and I will welcome everybody to the second part of our video, and we'll discuss Mimetic Desire. And welcome back, everyone, to Memetic Theory 101. This is our second video, but we're going to be going over what's typically called the first move of Mimetic Desire, or the first principle of Mimetic theory, which is Mimetic Desire. So Wolfgang, thank you for coming back and talking with us about these topics. Mimetic theory claims to offer a corrective to the popular understanding of desire and how desire functions. I was wondering if you could start off this this conversation with describing maybe what the popular version of desire is and how mimetic theory corrects that understanding.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point. The usual common everyday understanding of desire is that we or that a subject has a inner longing, and out of him or herself, the subject desires a certain object because of his autonomous will, because of his autonomous desire. But this is not really true if we take a closer look. And the most important thing to understand is that after we have satisfied our primary desires, which are not desires in that sense at all, maybe let's call them primary needs. So after we have fulfilled our primary needs, there is a longing in us which is not automatically oriented and directed. So most of the time we desire what others desire. We desire what people who we think are cool people, who we see as models, people whom we adore. What they desire becomes also our desire. So mimetic desire discovers that in the most important way, human desire is mimetic desire, meaning imitative desire, or borrowed desire. And sometimes I teach a lot, I taught and still teach courses on mimetic theory, especially grown-up people in the academia and so on. They resist that insight because they believe, of course, they themselves are completely autonomous. And they have questions about, is this a proper, profound anthropology? And I always say, look at the money what today in our world is invested in advertisement business, in fashion business. So the people who make money with anthropology indirectly, they understand what borrowed desire is, because most of the advertisement functions according to that cool people, people that are attractive, people that are adored. They show us products in order that we imitate their desire and become as powerful people and attractive people as they are. And we can observe that all the time in our own lives, just looking at advertisements.
Yeah, I mean, in the era of such political polarization, especially where I live in the United States, it's becoming more and more clear to me how we can start mimicking those that we think of our enemies too. Right? So as much as I don't like certain politicians, I can easily start mimicking the very thing that I detest about them in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
So this
I
is,
mean, there's also a deeper philosophical and even theological thesis connected to that. I discovered that later by coming across a reference to Plato, and then later on by reading Augustine's book, The City of God. And Augustine took it from Plato, and the thesis is we cannot not imitate what we adore. So human beings imitate what they adore. And this is a very powerful insight, and I think it's profoundly true that we imitate what we adore. And therefore, it's so important what we adore, because
yes.
what we adore, we will imitate. And so the choice of the models that are important for our life is really important. So this Platonic insight human beings imitate what they adore is profound. According to Augustine, it's in a nutshell the most important insight of a theory of religion.
Yeah.
So you see how deeply mimetic theory is also connected to these philosophical, theological insights.
Yeah, it's great. What role, we've talked about a little bit about envy in the introduction, but what role does envy play for mimetic theory? It's often, there's a new book out called Rene Gerard, The Prophet of Envy. And it's kind of a series of his interviews with folks. So it's almost as if mimetic theory could be a theory of envy. That's how important envy is to the theory. So could you talk about desire and envy a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very important topic, and I mean this is one of the emotions or the vices in our life that we all know and feel and have to deal with and have to learn how to cope with envy. I mean, Girard's only book that he wrote in English is his book on Shakespeare, which has the title A Theatre of Envy. So envy is really an emotion or a vice that you can explain with the help of mimetic theory in a very plausible and very profound way. But we also have to be careful. Mimetic theory is much more than just a theory of envy, because there's the other danger to see human beings as nothing but envious creatures. And this would be, again, a one-sided take on mimetic theory. So envy is one of the most important possibilities and outcomes of mimetic desire, but it's not by default, it's not necessary. So it's one version, very often, very nasty, very often, not a nice emotion, but it's just a description of the feeling that we see someone has an object, someone we adore has an object, and we want to have the same object. And if we cannot share it or cannot have the same, we easily develop envious feelings. But this is just one version. So mimetic theory is just broader than nothing but envy. But envy is, of course, a very important thing. And I mean, a lot of advertisements and a lot of the driving force of consumerism and all we let the economy go is envy driven in some way, in a broader sense.
What is the other alternative to envy? So it doesn't, mimetic theory doesn't have to lead to envy. Is there a more positive thing that mimetic theory could lead us towards?
In the tradition, and that was when I was writing my book, I became very fascinated in the traditional, so in the traditional philosophy, in Augustine, in St. Thomas. So until the 17th century, you have the very important distinction between emulation and envy. Emulation is something, for instance, the church fathers and the people responsible for a monastery or a cloister, they were always discussing, and they knew, of course, envy is very destructive. It's nothing worse than you have envious people in a monastery. But should you have emulation? Should you have mimetic encouragement? Should you have people who by mimetic desire get going, get in a positive sense competitive, get out of their beds to work and write and do something? Then all the people who thought in earlier times, is this a good thing? They said, yes, it's a good thing. If children in school are emulating each other, they become better students. So one of the problems we just discovered during the COVID-19 pandemic is that when all the students and people have to stay at home, this this positive emulation, this catching fire by the other is lacking. It's much more difficult. It's difficult to get it over video conferences or phone calls and so on, to catch the fire and to move forward. So this distinction between emulation and envy is a key distinction for hundreds of years of our tradition. And in some way it breaks down in the 17th century. So if you study the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, he is a philosopher who goes back to Aristotle and discovers and discusses Aristotle's and the traditional distinction between emulation and envy. But for Hobbes, it's no longer possible to distinguish these two emotions, these two feelings. So for him, it's the same, because the preconditions of these distinctions got weakened dramatically. And one of the preconditions is that emulation is in some way connected to longing for eternal goods who do not divide us so easily. I mean, for me, this was because I'm not a professor. Maybe indirectly I am, but but my university does not pay me to be a leading Gerardian.
Yes.
So that's not the main, because in today's academia, it's also a problem, of course. You have to subscribe to a discipline. So my discipline is Catholic social teaching, and you can ask teachers of this discipline all over the world, and there will be 90% who have never heard about Girard. So it's not essential in some way. But for me, I mean, I was studying Gerard and was very eager to get to know mimetic theory more and more. But at the same time, I developed my training in the discipline and wanted to become a professor. And for a certain time, I thought, for a couple of years, I thought, these are two tracks. So I have the Gerardian track and I have the track to become a professor in my field, and they do not go together. Oh, but wow. When I discovered this profound difference between envy and emulation, I suddenly understood that in all the encyclicals, papal encyclicals on social issues, you have as a foundation, as a basis, always the insight that we have to long for the eternal goods first. And if we do that, some of the social questions, social justice, economic equality, all those things can be easier handled. And if this orientation is not there, you are already caught up in the envious entanglements. So for me, that was very helpful. And then I also started to use mimetic theory in my basic course in Catholic social teaching, because in Catholic social teaching, you have many texts that are most of the time overlooked and not addressed today at all, because they think this is some kind of a pious topping of the cake and not necessary, not the real substance about the technical issues of social justice. But it's not true. I mean, this tradition always says God is the highest good and it should be in the center, the summum bonum, the highest good. And this outreach for the highest good is the precondition to distinguish between emulation, which is something good and inspires us and moves us forward, and envy that leads to destruction, to violence, and to very bad developments. And when I understood that finally, on one of the occasions, I was just calling René Girard on the phone, and I told him very excited way, this discovery, and he immediately referred me, and it's in the book, to a passage of Dante's Divine Comedy. In Dante is of course part of this traditional older world that understood those things perfectly well, and he immediately referred me to a passage in Dante where this is perfectly described, that how envy is always driving the people into into deadlocks and very difficult situation, and we have to look up for the higher goods in order to avoid those cul-de-sacs, those deadlocks.
This is so fascinating to me because oftentimes when I get into conversations with Gerardians, the topic of justice is seen as necessarily rivalristic, necessarily negative, necessarily um, something that you want to avoid, because justice is just another term for revenge in a lot of this thought. But you have a different view of justice and of social justice. And I think that your connection to it with the higher good is really helpful for me as I'm thinking this through, because I do hear a lot of sometimes Gerardians saying that justice is just just an outcome of the sacrificial elements, and we'll get more into that in the next episode. But could you say a little bit more about social justice and the higher good, and how to avoid justice just being another word for revenge?
I mean, there is one passage in the Sermon on the Mount, rather in the end, where you find the verse, "Seek the kingdom first, everything else will be given."
Mm.
And if you look at the social encyclicals of the Catholic popes from the later 19th century onwards until today, there is nearly not one encyclical where this verse is not quoted.
Mm.
So the question is this just a topping of the cake to make it more biased, to make it more religious, or is this substantially important? And I think it's substantially important, because it says, if your primary concern, if the most important things in your life is money or promotion or other worldly goods, you will absolutely and unavoidably run into rivalries and in very difficult situations, because you will create automatically scarcity, and there is no easy way out of that. And so this is a spiritual precondition, that you say, if all those worldly concerns are not at the center of your longing, then you can manage those things, because then it's a question of sharing. Then you can have some kind of, and this is important for those who are rich, and it's important for those who are poor, because if both do not try to detach in that sense from those worldly goods, there is no way out of class struggle and violence and all those competition. And we have to live that. We have to give examples for that in real life, and then the other things can be handled. If everything is focusing just on worldly goods, which are always divisive and scarce, there is no good way. So then there is just the struggle, and then you have the struggle of the more powerful will get the things, and those who are less powerful try to get as much power as possible to turn the thing around. But it's always this zero-sum game, which is a very dangerous thing in some way. And probably in our modern world, we solve this zero-sum game by exploiting nature and the environment in a very terrible way, leading to the climate change and the crisis we are confronted with now. But we have to go back and focus our main desires in a different way. And I don't know about the Protestant tradition, but when I teach Catholic students, we have this tradition that at one occasion in a mass, in the celebration of the Eucharist, the priest says, "Raise your hearts," sursum corde in Latin. And in the Catholic community, the people stand up. and say, we have it, we turned it to the Lord in some way. Is that also in the Protestant tradition the same?
We have things similar to that, yeah.
Yeah, and we stand up, and I think this is a weekly orientation in that sense. But this is not just some bias thing. This is anthropologically essential. So and I was just fascinated and struck when I saw this is really mentioned in all the encyclicals. But most of the teachers or those who interpret or teach those encyclicals or social justice no longer focus on those things because they do not understand the anthropological meaning of it.
Wow. Your conversation about external goods is really great and helpful, and reminds me of the difference between internal and external mediation that Gerard talks a lot about, and that's always been helpful for me to understand rivalry and how to avoid rivalry. And what's the difference between internal and external mediation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also important. I mean, rivalry, as I said already before, you can distinguish between emulation and envy, and emulation is something good and brings the best out of all of us. But mimetic desire has many different outcomes and many different types. And one key distinction that was introduced by Gerard already in his first book is the distinction between internal and external mediation. And this is just a conceptualization of the closeness of the subject and the model. So if the subject and the model are very close to each other, the chance that imitation gets rivalrous and destructive and violent is much, much higher. So therefore, the key insight, and there was just a couple of years ago, the former chief rabbi Jonathan Sacks in Great Britain wrote a book on violence and religion, saying what we can learn from Gerard is that the most important source of human violence is sibling rivalry. So rivalry between brothers or between sisters or siblings, because they are so close to each other. You know, if you have a brother who is about the same age as you are, you're living in the same space, you're living in the same stage of your own development. So the likelihood that you get caught up in aiming for the same things that cannot be shared is very strong. And I have a very good example, and this is proven by sophisticated social science literature. We know that in a big company, if the CEO of a big company earns 20, 30, 40 times more than you, who are probably on the third stage of a company, this is not a big trouble for us. But if we hear that the leader of a department who is on the same level as yourself gets $10 more as an annual salary, that drives us crazy. So this is an example. We compare, of course, with those who are closest to us most eagerly, and there is the most dangerous possibility of rivalry turning into an envious, destructive way. So sibling rivalry is an important insight, and it's also the insight your neighbor is more likely to become a rival than a person who lives continents away, or the further away you are, the less likelihood is that there will be conflicts and rivalry for the same goods that cannot be shared. And that can be external rivalry. You can have a model from history. So if you want to become a good writer as Goethe, you don't become a rival with Goethe himself because he's dead already for centuries. So this is external mediation. But if you want to be better as your brother, it's difficult to avoid that. And you can go again back to writers in ancient times who already wrote about sibling rivalry when they gave the recommendation, if your brother goes into medicine, go into horse trading, not into medicine. So try to do something different in order to avoid these problems that are so likely.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the important moves in this, in desire, understanding desire, is the scandal, or the scandalon. And Gerard, I think, talks about that quite a bit in Deceit, Desire in the novel. What is this scandal, and what does it have to do with desire?
Girard always refers to the literal translation of scandal, and it means stumbling block, a stumbling block. So if you get caught up into rivalry with some of your neighbors, with a close friend or a close collaborator, the scandal consists in that the imitation of your neighbor, of your collaborator, easily turns him into an adversary. He starts as a model, but as soon as you desire the same things and focus on things that cannot be shared or divided or whatever, then you are caught up, and the model who triggered your desire becomes the person who hinders you to get what you desire. So this is the stumbling block. So the model becomes a stumbling block, something again and again described in the New Testament, which has a deep anthropological understanding of things that easily happen to us human beings.
Yeah, it's interesting because you write in your book about this model obstacle relationship, and how when we get to this point, we often want to make ourselves look completely different than the other. But you write, what they miss, or what we miss when we're in this relationship, is that their need to differ only increases their identicalness as they become more exact mirror reflections of each other. And this is one of the things that's kind of counterintuitive about mimetic theory, is that we always want to make ourselves, or think of ourselves, as so much different from our rivals, or from those we call our enemies. But in that difference, we end up looking almost exactly the same. Could you say more about that? Because it's so, like, it's very counterintuitive.
Yeah, that's true. And most of the time, we explain conflicts and rivalries by referring to our differences. But we just have to step out and look at conflicts. We are not involved in it ourselves, and look at conflicts between colleagues of us, and we see how they look alike, how easily the more they think they are different, they are actually becoming more and more alike. So this is also a very interesting and old phenomenon, that conflicts turn adversaries into enemy brothers, mirroring each other. And at the same time, the deep insight, the more there is a lack of difference between us. As I explained already with the reference to sibling rivalry, the more likely it is that we become entangled in rivalries. So the lack of differences is one of the most important sources for rivalries. And as soon as we are caught up in rivalries, that makes us even more, turns us even more into mirrors of each other. So probably violence and rivalry, as soon as they escalate, they are very imitative. I think one of the understandings, if you study violence, human violence, a little bit closer, you will realize there is nothing so contagious as violence. And contagion means also this making the people all going in the same direction, and this is can easily lead to a cycle of violence, a dangerous cycle of violence, an escalation to extremes, as Gerard pointed it out in his last book.
Mm. And the answer to that, as you've been saying, is emulation, is searching or desiring a higher good. Is that right?
Yeah. Or you can also use a negative term, detachment. I
Yes.
mean, detachment from all those, if you avoid making those things primary, which cannot be shared, you you are on a good road. I mean, it just comes to my mind, one of the traditional Muslim sayings is, wish for yourself what you can also wish for your brother. So that means put at the center of your desire things that you can share. And if you do that, we would be on a better road, on a better way. But it's difficult. I mean, we forget it too often.
Yes, absolutely. So this move to mimetic desire is described in Deceit, Desire, and the novel. And as we conclude this section of our conversations, what Gerard says that he got this from the great novelists. What makes a novelist great? And what are there particular novels that you would suggest in order to understand mimetic theory?
I mean, this is a difficult question because even some of the critiques of René Girard said, well, he's not really into literature. He's only into literature as long as it confirms his own theory. And partly that's true, but on the other hand, you can say great literature is written by those writers who understood our entanglements, our strange relations, how they develop and so on. So the great writers become in some way great writers because they are read over centuries, or their plays are performed over centuries. So, I mean, why do we know that Shakespeare is a great writer of tragedies and comedies? Because even today, most of the theaters will play at least once in a year one of his famous plays, right? And why are they played? Because when people watch those plays, they understand it, and it helps them to understand their own life better. Yeah. So I think that's the easiest answer to your question. And my recommendation would be, start reading those 5 novelists that are covered in Girard's Deceit, Desire, and the novel: Cervantes, Flaubert, Stendhal, Dostoevsky, and Proust. And today later he said he would add to that Virginia Woolf, and we could add Jane Austen, and we could add a lot more, of course, today. And for me, one of the examples of a great writer was a discovery I made when I was writing the book, when I was reading Goethe's autobiography. And on a first look, Goethe is not a very, from a later perspective, Goethe was very calm, very relaxed. He was the adored writer in Germany and beyond Germany. And once he said he cannot understand how a person can be envious, because envy is such a base emotion. It's not up to real human being. But first of all, one of his early novels, what is the sorrows of the young Werther? Is it the sufferings of the young Werther? It's a novel that I think is based on his own experiences as a young man. And this young man is caught up in a triangle relationship. He falls in love with a married woman and even kills himself later on, caused at that time a huge mimetic crisis because many young men killed themselves after reading that novel. But in his much later autobiography, he made a very interesting insight. And I think this is the insight only a great writer can make, because he describes a little bit what he experienced when he was young, and that led to this early novel. He said, I was very attracted to a woman, and one of my closest friends, I said to him, I have to introduce you to this woman. And his friend was not at all convinced, and he said, I do not understand how you can fall in love with this woman. She was not very beautiful, she's married, everything speaks against her. And Goethe writes, it's dangerous if your friend falls in love with the woman you like. But then he continues and says, but it's also dangerous if he dislikes what you adore. Because if your best friend does not imitate your desire for this woman, that diminishes and questions your own desire, and you are no longer sure, is the woman I desire a woman worth to be desired? And I mean, he summarizes that in one sentence or in two sentences. This is a deep insight, and we all know that experience. We all know this experience. And writers who can describe these bizarre and strange experiences we all have throughout our life, I think those are the great writers. And those who make it easy and don't go into that level, they might be nice writers, but are not great novelists or great poets or playwrights.
I had a similar experience recently when I went to, there have been all of these Black Lives Matter protests here in the States. And I went to one of the protests, and I had what I thought was an awesome progressive t-shirt on. And I was going to this progressive protest, and I was like, oh man, people are going to say this is so awesome. Everybody ignored it. Like, is as if I wasn't wearing it, like this t-shirt at all. And I was like, maybe this t-shirt isn't as cool as I thought it was.
Yeah, right. that's a very similar experience.
Yeah. So it's from like love interest to the clothing we wear. We all want affirmation back of our own coolness, or our what we think is our coolness or greatness or whatever. So
yeah, we always, I think that's also important insight of mimetic theory. We are not sure if the objects and goals that we desire are really good objects. So as soon, and I observed it with myself, as soon as we buy a new phone or a new computer or a new car, we try to convince all our friends that this is the best choice you can make, in order that they imitate us and confirm our own choice that we are not absolutely happy. And as soon as some friend said, you are an idiot, we already despise our own choice. So this is a thing, and it relates also to religion, because there are religious people who are very eager to convince everyone their approach of what they think is most important. And this is not so much a proof of their strengths in faith. It's the other way around. They are not really sure, so they try to get as much followers for their own beliefs in order to be convinced that this is true. And so it's a very interesting insight if you understand that a certain kind of missionary attitude is still a result of a lack of a calm, faithful rootedness. Let's call it that way.
Reminds me of Shakespeare's great quote when he says, "Methinks the lady doth protest too much."
Mm-hmm.
The more aggressive we are in trying to get people to come on our side for religion, the more likely it is, as you say, we're just trying to convince ourselves of its own importance. So great stuff. So thank you, Wolfgang, for this session on Memetic Theory 101, and our next session will be the Scapegoat Mechanism and the origins of culture. So everybody stay tuned for that. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to this Memetic Theory 101 session. We are on our third video now with Wolfgang Palaver. And Wolfgang, thanks for coming back and guiding us through the steps of Memetic theory. And the second major insight for Memetic theory is sacrifice, the scapegoat mechanism, and the origin of culture. And obviously, this is a massive topic that is worthy of volumes of books to discuss, and volumes of books have been discussed on it. So we'll just touch on a few things in this, but maybe starting with your reframing of archaic religions into what was the term that you called it?
Early religions.
Early
religions.
Early religions. Yeah. How do go ahead.
The reason for changing the terminology has to do with recent research by a couple of people looking at the development and the involvement or the emergence of early religions, like Robert Beller's book, The Evolution of Human Religion, Charles Taylor. Many more researchers were involved over a couple of years, and they distinguish between archaic religion, early religion, pre-axial religion, post-axial religion, axial religion. And I think this discussion about pre-axial and axial religions is very important for the whole discussion. And in the discussions of these scholars, archaic religion is already connected to early big empires, not tribal societies, so not really the early stage of hunter-gatherers, but already established empires. So I think we should make mimetic theory more accessible. And so therefore, what Gerard calls archaic society, I today call either pre-axial or early religions. And I follow in this regard the terminology of Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, who himself became more and more interested in mimetic theory and has written quite a bit on mimetic theory. But just to not to have our insular terminology, but to connect to scholarly discussions outside, I think it's important to shift that a little bit and to distinguish accordingly.
Nice, yes. So what is Gerard's theory about religion and the origin of culture?
Yeah, the important thing, and that has now to do with my forthcoming new book, is what he describes in especially Violence and the Sacred is the so-called emergence of the sacred. So in German, you have much more problems because the translation of this book in German, they use the German term for holy, and then the whole thing goes already in the wrong direction. There is a huge confusion with all these terms. But if you look closely, Gerard from the very beginning more or less talks all the time about the sacred. And the sacred is a religion that comes out of human interaction. So it's not a religion in the sense as we understand this term today as something God-given, but it's a creation of human beings. It's a religion, as he already said in Things Hidden, that comes from human beings and not from God. And it's a social, psychological, unconscious mechanism how early tribal groups that came into troubles because of many mimetic rivalries in this group. And it's most likely that some of those groups were not able to overcome this crisis and finally destroyed themselves. But it's also, and we have a lot of myth and anthropological material that suggests that some of those tribes overcame their internal crisis, their internal troubles, by expelling or killing one of his members and turning this scapegoat who was expelled or killed into the first tribal deity. So the expelled scapegoat becomes the tribal god, which in a first sense sounds really weird. And we
Yeah.
modern people do not understand that. But it's important to understand why we do not understand it and to go back a little bit. And the famous example that Gerard again and again used to illustrate his theory was the Edibus myth.
Mm.
And it's described in many ancient Greek texts, but especially in two tragedies by Sophocles, King Edibus, or Edibus the Tyrant, I think is also a title, and then Edibus on Kolonos. And you have to put those two tragedies together. And in the first tragedy, what takes place there is something we all know, because we all know, of course, scapegoating. I mean, there is no family, no classroom without a black sheep or with one who is treated like a scapegoat. So scapegoating is something we all know. But what we do not understand, that's especially what we see in the second tragedy, that a scapegoat is suddenly adored. Because in the second tragedy, when Oedipus was already expelled from his own city Thebes, and Athens are in competition which city will later on have the graveyard, the burial place of Oedipus inside his city walls, because the city that will have the burial place of Oedipus inside its walls will flourish extremely. And I think we do not understand this. I mean, a normal modern person does not understand how someone who is despised, who is seen as a troublemaker, has to be expelled. We know how we deal with despised people, how we deal with scapegoats, but we do not know how to turn them into gods, into adorable people. But if we want to understand the mechanism that led to the emergence of early religions, we have to understand what we cannot really understand.
Mm.
And I think mimetic theory helps us to understand it, because it shows that a tribal group that is really in frenzy, in complete crisis, can suddenly unite mimetically. Again, one imitates the other by suddenly expelling one person as seeming to be the culprit who caused all the troubles. But as soon as this person is killed or expelled, there is unity, there is harmony, there is peace, there is a calm serenity there in this group. And the people who do not know what they are doing, because even when they kill them, they feel they are in some way puppets of this powerful troublemaker. They also think that this person is not only the troublemaker who caused the crisis, but this person is so powerful that he was also able to give the peace that has now emerged among the group. And this is what Gerard calls the double transference, which creates the ambiguous and ambivalent early sacred. And if we now study myth or study old terms like the Latin term satsa, if we go to a good dictionary of Latin and look up the meaning of satsa, we realize satsa was cursed and blessed at the same time. Something that we think does not go together, but if we understand this double transference, we suddenly see how the very old old sacred words in many, many cultures have all this ambiguity. And now we can understand this ambiguity. And this is so important to understand the early religions and distinguish them, and also see that many things that happen today are different, and we have to understand the difference to understand how early religions work and function.
I'm reminded of Gerard's emphasis on the pharmacon, the ambiguity of this, the dose of channeling violence against a scapegoat so that the community can survive.
Right. I mean, this is a small dose of poison that becomes a healing medicine. But it's an ambivalent thing, as you rightly described it. And again, we can explain it with the help of this double transference, that everything that was bad and caused the troubles is transferred and projected onto the scapegoat, but also all the peaceful, harmonious stage afterwards is also projected onto the scapegoat, and that turns the scapegoat into a divinity. And I think that's the most important thing when I teach classes on mimetic theory. I spend a lot of time just to show the students how important it is to understand this thing that is not plausible automatically and at the first glance from our modern perspective, because we all know the transference and projection of the negative things on a scapegoat, but we rarely have a real deeper insight into the positive transference, so that the good things are projected on the people. We have some glimpses, but in this deeper sense, this has gone. This is no longer there in our world, and we will probably discuss it later. But the way that we cannot understand this thing really easily has to do with the influence of the Judeo-Christian tradition, or to put it in a broader way, the influence of the axial revolution, as it is called now, in a broader sense, what happened more or less all over the world over a period of a couple of centuries.
So what is it about the scapegoat mechanism, Gerard calls it? What does he mean by mechanism?
Mechanism means that probably the element of liberty, of conscientious decision to participate in that mechanism is most likely not there, or only there to a very small degree. So for me, the best example to describe the mechanism is this biblical passage of the prevention of the stoning of the adulterous woman in the New Testament. Because when the mob, who is completely in frenzy and completely excited, approaches Jesus, telling him, "We caught this woman in an adulterous act, she has to be stoned immediately." You can imagine this is really a mob. This is really a crowd where the singular participants do not really know what they are doing. They are just one compact block. And so they act like a mechanism. So it's not a real free decision of each individual to participate. As soon as they are drawn into this crowd, like a magnetic pull, they are drawn into it mechanically. And the interesting thing is the intervention of Jesus, now that's the other side, when he says, whoever is without sin might cast the first stone, is in some way an interruption that breaks the mechanism. And if we continue reading that passage, it's so fascinating that it says, then starting with the elders, they went away alone as single individuals. So for me, this passage is one of the most fascinating passage, because it can be an illustration what the axial revolution or this Judeo-Christian interruption really brought forward. You have in the beginning the mechanically connected, pulled together, magnetically connected mob who wants to kill unanimously, and then something, Jesus in that way interrupts this electric unity, breaks it up, and then they go away one by one. So the mechanism is this mimetic pull of a group acting together. And we all know first of all, we all know that when we are at our worst, most of the time, it's when we are part of a group who is not active. So in groups, we most likely are easier doing things we would not do as a single individual. And so sometimes the group pressure in some way has a strong mechanical dimension. And it's not the freedom we think we live.
Yes. Could you say more about that? Because what memetic theory has to offer to help us understand freedom and free will?
I mean, mimetic theory sometimes is understood in that way that people understand this theory as a theory that is completely mechanical. So there are people who say this violence is inevitable, everything works according to these mechanistic rules of the scapegoat mechanism of a violent human nature. But this is not Gerard's understanding. So he, in his book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, there are two sentences in it, not close together, maybe about 10 pages in between. But those two sentences have to be brought together. The first sentence is, he accuses social scientists that they see conflicts as something that is not normal, extraordinary, and they don't focus on conflicts at all, because conflicts are an interruption of the usual nice going together of us human beings. And Gerard says, no, this is wrong. Look at our world, look at our families, our groups. Conflicts happen so easily. We should not see conflicts as something unusual, not normal at all. But 20 pages or 10 pages, I do not recall now the page numbers, but that doesn't matter. You read the sentence, mimetic desire is intrinsically good. So Gerard emphasizes in the one sense, be aware, conflicts between human beings are very likely, and to overlook them is just to get everything wrong. But there is no necessary, inevitable mechanism that forces us to behave in that way. So therefore, there is always a little bit of liberty or freedom involved, but much less than we usually think. We usually think the modern people, we are free people and we rationally decide and make our choices and so on. And Gerard would say there is always an element of freedom involved, but most of the time much smaller than we think. And so the importance is to strengthen this element of choice. So just in the story that I mentioned about the adulterous woman, Jesus is able to bring this moment of choice out into the open. He forces the people to think, are you really wanting to join this crowd in stoning the woman? Or if you think now for yourself, what is your take on that? Then people can suddenly follow him in some way by making their individual decision. So mimetic theory shows us how strongly imitative mechanisms govern our life, but it's not something we cannot get rid of or cannot avoid. It's not easy and not very likely, but it's always possible.
Can you talk about the non-conscious or unconscious element of mimetic desire and how we get caught up in these crowd behavior?
I mean, in general, mimetic desire works on a very deep emotional level, so that very often we are caught up in mimetic desire without being aware of it. So you see it in fashion, for instance, when all the people think they are really choosing their clothes and the way they walk out into the streets in their very original own meaning. And nevertheless, we are living in a world where fashion plays a big role, and so we are not in that sense. We are relational beings, so therefore we always look at the other, what we wear, and change our fashion, and even those who want to create a new fashion can only create a new fashion by getting followers to follow them. And if you have no followers, your fashion will never become, or your attempt to create a fashion will not flesh out. Will not.
Yeah. In our previous episode, you mentioned that it could be that violence is the most mimetic thing. And that's the most non-conscious thing when we get caught up in having a common enemy. Is one of the easiest ways to find unity, and that's behind the scapegoat mechanism, right? Just wanting to be part of, as you say, relational beings, just wanting to be part of something bigger than ourselves, which can easily get caught up in this non-conscious element of being part of the crowd and being part of those who want to stone the woman.
Yeah. I mean, especially in times of crisis, joining a group which is against someone or against another group is a very likely pattern in human life, and we see it again and again. I mean, I referred to the Edibus Myth as a key example to illustrate the scapegoat mechanism. And the Edibus Myth starts with the plague in the city of Thebes. It's the plague. And the plague causes people to look for a scapegoat. Who is to blame for the plague? There is a big crisis. We want to join together in blaming someone. And if we find the scapegoat who seems to have caused the plague, maybe we can overcome it. And we are in the corona pandemic, and we see attempts and scapegoating tendencies to scapegoat all over the place. Is it a Chinese virus? Is it created by the Jews, by Bill Gates, by George Soros, by other evil forces? So that's a very likely pattern. And I'm the last couple of years, again, advertisement of my new book, because at the center of my new book is also a treatment of Henri Bergson's book of 1932, Two Sources of Moral and Religion. And this is a key book also to understand René Girard, because he shows that the tendency to form closed societies is nearly a natural pattern. It's nearly a natural pattern. So if you understand, because Bergson really tried to think through and build on evolutionary theory, and shows that closed societies with all these enemy patterns, scapegoating and so on, is the most likely development of human social life in the very beginning. And this is very close what Girard, in a little bit different approach, also observed. So I bring those theories together, and that's very helpful. But the more important thing is, because this is in some way also close to some observations of Durkheim, I mean, less the violent element, but also how religion and society is the same. But the interesting thing about Bergson is his book has the title Two Sources of Moral and Religion, two. So he distinguishes two types of religion, very close to what Gerard later did when he distinguished between the sacred that we described now, when we talked about the scapegoat mechanism, and the holy or the saintly. And Bergson distinguishes between static religion and dynamic religion, and with that goes along socially closed societies and open society. So this is I think very important, because you see that there is a natural leaning, a natural tendency towards scapegoating, something always discussed also in Girardian circles. How can that be explained? But the helpful thing about Bergson is that he says, naturally, we are most likely always ending up in closed societies. And closed societies can be, where at the beginning tribes, but also big empires can be closed societies. That means imperialism, even if these are big empires, are from their character still closed societies. And there is no way of a closed society just by expanding the realm to become an open society. The difference between closed societies and open societies is not by degree. Those are very different types of social life. But the interesting thing I wanted to address is that Bergson said the open society has also a starting point in nature. So it's not the closed society is natural and the open society comes out of the blue or from nowhere or from heaven in a bad type of theology. It's probably going to a deeper level of creation and human life. To that, what we Christians at least understand as a God who is a living God and not a God of death.
What is
this is also
so
this
what
is also important for many discussions we have now in regard to the corona crisis.
Yeah, so what is the difference between a closed society and an open society?
I mean, the closed society creates internal harmony and solidarity against an outside group. And later on, I mean, the psychoanalyst and psychologist and philosopher who shares your name to a certain degree, Erik Erikson.
Yes.
He created in 1966 a very interesting term. It's called pseudo-speciation. Pseudo-speciation. So the closed society gives the people inside such a closed tribal society the impression we are human beings, and all outside our tribes are even not from the same species. They are not human beings as we are. We can go back in many descriptions of such early societies, early tribes. The term human beings was always only used for themselves, and already people outside the tribe were not seen as human beings in the same sense as they themselves saw. So although biologically we know that all human beings are really the same species, culturally we see that culturally we often behave in a way that other human beings are not seen as the same species. And that is, of course, a very dangerous cause for violence and injustice and so on. I think the current discussion about Black Lives Matters, but many more phenomena. I mean, Erikson was talking about fascism, National Socialism, scapegoating of Jews, anti-Semitism. There are many, many examples of this pseudo-speciation. And Gerard, in his book, Evolution and Conversion, he was asked what he says about pseudo-speciation by referring to Eibel Eibesfeld, who took up this term from Erikson. And he easily can say and says, well, this is easily to explain with the help of mimetic theory and the understanding of scapegoat mechanism, because the scapegoat mechanism turns internal violence in something outside, because the scapegoat is always a member of the group. But through this double transference of projecting all the bad and the good onto this person, he becomes completely different. He becomes a divine being, no longer the same as the group, something outside. And all the demonic, all the negative side is also projected to the outside. So when this group later on constitutes itself and behaves in some way, it's completely understandable that they see themselves as human beings, and the outside is a demonic, dark, dangerous world. So this is a very important step to see how from the scapegoat mechanism, friend-enemy patterns, a group in enmity against other groups emerge.
So an open society, how would that look?
An open society would be a society that overcomes friend-enemy patterns, that would be characterized by universal fraternity. Mm. So that's the description Bergson gives. And the example he gives is, for him, the summit of the open society is the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' commandment to love our enemies. Mm. And I think this commandment to love our enemies is anthropologically such a tremendous insight, because it says, it was said to you, love your friends and hate your enemies. So this is your way of thinking. But I say to you, we have to love our enemies. We have to love our enemies, not hate them. So in former times in Christianity, this passage was read as against the Hebrew Bible, saying, well, the Hebrew Bible, the Jews, they hate their enemies and love their friends, and we Christians are beyond that. We live eternal fraternity. This is a complete misreading, because many Jewish scholars said to us, I mean, of course, the Hebrew Bible again and again says we have to love our friends, but you don't find the passage love your enemies, hate your enemies in the Hebrew Bible. The most latest German Catholic tradition translation of the Bible makes that very clear, because all the passages that come from the Hebrew Bible are in italic. And when you look up this quote now in the new translation, the first part, love your friends, is in italics. Hate your enemies is not in italics. So it has nothing to do with the New Testament over against the Hebrew Bible. We have to read it anthropologically. And if we read it anthropologically, then Jesus is just telling us this is the usual pattern. The usual pattern of human life is you love your friends and hate your enemies. But we have to overcome this pattern. So this is the central insight of Bergson's description of the open society. And the interesting thing is that he doesn't do it on an abstract level, because he's a little bit criticizing liberal philosophers who think that it's very easy to create the open society. And Bergson understood it's not easy, because the usual pattern is the pattern Jesus describes in this passage, and to move beyond that pattern needs extraordinary saintly people who can pull by a positive mimesis people in their direction. And he refers to Saint Francis, to Jesus, to the Hebrew prophets. I mean, he's a little bit like Gerard, a little bit too much into a superiority of Christianity. But if we read the whole thing today, we could say there are, and this is the observation of Bergson, it's open society is naturally possible, because again and again people emerge, people lived in our world who were able to break through these friend-enemy patterns that comes from the scapegoat mechanism.
Yeah, it's so great, and we'll talk about it more in the next in our series when we talk about biblical revelation. But you know, in the book of Exodus, there's this law that says if your enemy's ox is stuck in the ditch, go help your enemy get their ox out of the ditch. Right? So
And this is
there are laws, and even the great general Naaman, who's part of Israel's enemies, comes to Elijah, and Elijah heals the great enemy of Israel. And so you get where Jesus is formed out of this loving strand within his scripture, within Jewish tradition. And that's where he's coming from.
Yeah, and so important that you just referred now to these passages, because especially Christian communities and Christians have to learn these sides of the Hebrew Bible that are often not known at all, and to understand that it's not Christianity over against the Hebrew Bible, but it's over against our first natural leaning that does not necessarily turn us into enemies, but most likely, and there is a way out of it.
Yes, absolutely. Back to scapegoating, there you talk in your book about the stereotypes of persecution, which when I read that, it was so illuminating for me. So there you talk about the 4 different stereotypes: stereotype of crisis, accusation, victim, and violence. And I was wondering if you could just briefly talk about those 4 different stereotypes of persecution.
Yeah, I think the best way to address those stereotypes is again to use the Edibus myth as an example. So the stereotype of crisis is that scapegoating and those things most of the time happen in times of crisis. So many myths, many stories we have start with a crisis. Very often a crisis of contagion, a pandemic, a plague. And we have it in the Edibus myth. Everything starts with the plague that nearly destroys the whole city. And that's very important today to address that, because we are struggling with such a plague right now. So we are more open to understand that crisis. And in that crisis, people are in alert. People are more likely to scapegoat, to react violently. So that's the first stereotype. The second stereotype is the stereotype of accusation. And Edibus is accused of killing the king, regicide, killing his father, patricide, and sleeping with his mother, incest. And the tragedy of Sophocles is in some way a crime story, one of the first crime stories ever created. And Sandor Goodhart, one of the early students of Gerard, showed convincingly the interesting thing about this tragedy is that all the clues that are given before would necessitate an investigation what really happened. But as soon as those stereotypes of accusation stick to Oedipus, the investigation is stopped. And I mean, there is a witness who said the king, the former king, was killed by many. And if he was killed by many, it couldn't be Oedipus who, according to the myth, killed himself by being alone with his father, just meeting him at the crossing. But as soon as the stereotypes of accusation stick on Oedipus, the discussion is stopped and he becomes the scapegoat. And so Sophocles in some way already undermines it a little bit, because he shows us actually this is an investigation that was not really gone through the whole thing to find out what really happened. The third stereotype is now the signs of the victims. So we know from scapegoating, we see it in the animal world, but it's also true in the human world, that certain extraordinary signs make it more likely that you or someone becomes a scapegoat. So Oedipus limps, so he is limping, he is crippled. So that's something that can easily lead to scapegoating. And just my daughter 3 weeks ago told me, because she's living in a rural place with some hens, and there was one hen that had a fault or something with her head, and she was really killed by the others. So they picked her head, and they had to kill. So something we know from the animal world, but it's a little bit similar in classrooms among kids. If someone sticks out in some way, it's easy that he becomes a scapegoat. So Oedipus is a scapegoat in many ways. He limps. He's a stranger from another city, and he's also a king. That means also if you are outstanding politically, culturally, in powerful way, you are in danger. It seems again strange, but we can look at our history. If you study, for instance, the history of the early kings in the European medieval history, it was very likely that you will not die peacefully in your bed with high age. It's more likely that you get killed along the way. So this is the stereotype of the sign of the victim. And then you have the stereotype of violence. So Oedipus, who is so overwhelmed by group pressure that even he himself thinks that he's guilty, and he himself blinds him and expels himself from the city. And we know from trials in the Stalinist area, but also in the modern area and other totalitarian societies, enormous group pressure even can become so strong that a victim who is innocent no longer can really hold on to his innocence. It's very difficult over against a big group to stay firm on being convinced of your innocence. So these stereotypes is a very helpful methodological tool, and it's developed in Gerard's book, The Scapegoat, which is probably from the scholarly and scientific and methodological point of view, the most developed book of him, because he really tried to convince other scholars that his method is not a weird, strange religious Christian theory, but it's really a profound theory which can be used in a plausible way and in a step-by-step way. That he says, if we use those 4 stereotypes, for instance, to interpret medieval witch hunts or medieval massacres against Jews, we follow exactly those stereotypes. And even if we read those medieval texts, we all know if there was a crisis and the people said the Jews had poisoned the wells and therefore they were killed, there is no discussion among scholars today that this is a typical persecution text. So there were people innocently killed in order to overcome a crisis which had no relationship. And Gerard's attempt is now said, let's use the same method to interpret early myth of early culture. And he said, even if the element of violence is not really there, if we have the other three stereotypes, it's already very likely that those clues help us to reveal the same kind of pattern of scapegoating of innocent people in order to overcome a crisis, as we do it with medieval texts of persecution.
That reminds me of Gerard's emphasis that oftentimes myths lack the violent element. It in a way that the Bible, which we'll get to a little later, doesn't. And one of the I think the word for myth, where it comes from, is muo, which means to silence the voice. So myth, Gerard emphasizes over and over again, is about silencing the voice of the victim.
Mm-hmm. And also the double transference helps us to understand what you just described, because a myth turns everything in the end in a positive, harmonious, peaceful world. So therefore, after the crisis, it's not so necessary to talk a lot about the violence, talk about prohibitions, taboos, that some things should never happen again, so that the crisis does not break out again, and maybe peaceful rites which in some way repeat the mechanism. But it's very likely that the violent element is diminished. First of all, the persecuting mob does not realize itself as the perpetrator, but it realizes itself as a puppet of this powerful, monstrous being that created the crisis and gave the peace. So therefore, in myth, there is from the very beginning onwards a tendency to suppress the element of violence, the force stereotype.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Wolfgang. And we will talk more about myth and the difference between myth and Bible and Christianity and Judaism. And so you talked about early religions, right, instead of archaic religions. Is it still, do we still talk about revealed religions, or is that is there another term for that we should use?
I mean, revealed religion, axial religion, all those terms, post-axial religions, you can also say, are good terms. And I especially like now to distinguish between the sacred and the holy.
Okay. Well,
two terms that are so often mixed together or used arbitrarily one for the other. But following Gerard and following those anthropological insights, it makes a lot of sense to distinguish between the religion created by human beings and the religion given by God, between the sacred and the holy, between the sacred and the saintly.
Wonderful. We will talk more about that in our next and final episode, episode 4. Awesome. Okay. It's good. Good stuff. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to episode 4 with Wolfgang Palaver as we continue to discuss memetic theory. And we are at the stage, the third stage in the memetic insight, which is revealed religions as opposed to, I guess, early religions. And we've just talked about myth. And one of the important things to discuss that memetic theory helps me understand is the difference between the Bible and ancient myths. So we just talked in the last episode about how myths tend to silence the violence that happens in those myths. And a lot of people criticize the Bible for being so violent. The violence in the Bible is kind of set before us in a way that makes me and others uncomfortable, and atheists who criticize the Bible a lot uncomfortable too. So they see it as a reason that we should just do away with the Bible, all the violence within it. And so what is the difference, Wolfgang, between the Bible and myth, and what do we do with the violence within the Bible?
That's again a question that would need a whole book.
Can you do that in about 2 minutes?
Yeah, but let me try to start not with the difference. Let me try to start with the similarity between myth and the Bible, because Gerard himself struggled for a very long time to respond exactly to your question in a concise and clear and plausible and not too complicated way. And the most important insight he gained, interestingly, from a severe and harsh critique of religion and especially Christianity from Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, whom Gerard labeled as the most important theologian of the 19th century, because Nietzsche clearly understood that what some of the religious studies scholars in the 19th century discovered, that many elements we find in myth is also in the biblical texts. And they started to say, well, the claim of the churches that the myths are just fairy tales and the Bible is true is just wrong. It's completely wrong. And Nietzsche also understands that the structure of those texts is very similar. In many of those texts, in myths, like in the Bible, we find the persecution of single individuals. We find martyrdom, we find perpetration. And Nietzsche understood the difference. And so Nietzsche saw the difference is not that in one text there is persecution and the other not. The difference is on with whom is the text siding. The myth just says, well, violence and persecution is part of human life. We have to go through it. We have to deal with it. But this is the way of life. Whereas the biblical texts emphasize the innocent of the persecuted victims. And this is a very important insight. So we have in many of those texts collective persecution of single individuals or minorities. But in the mythological texts in early religion, the persecution of victims is justified. Whereas in the Bible, you have many, many texts where this persecution of single individuals or minorities is harshly criticized by siding with those innocent scapegoats and persecuted scapegoats. And so you have at the same time similarity and difference. And the difference between Nietzsche and Gerard is that Nietzsche sided with the old pagan myth over against the Bible, whereas Gerard, like more or less the modern world, directly or indirectly, of course, understood that we are not allowed and justified to persecute single individuals. So our emphasis on human rights, our emphasis to overcome persecution, I think is closely connected to this spirit of revealed religions, of this spirit of siding with persecuted victims. So that's the first thing. So in order to understand really the difference, you have to highlight the similarity, because if you do not address the similarity, then the whole thing has no connection. Then the Bible would really prevent Hollywood-style, nice, rosy success story or a story to have good feelings, but not really related to the struggles and troubles of real life. And that leads to your second question: why is there so much violence in the texts described in the Bible? And Gerard's thesis, which is, I think, again, a quite plausible and justifiable thesis, is that the Bible addresses the violence of persecution that happens among human beings and brings it out into the open. So I like one of his metaphors and one of his illustrations very much. He said, the myth who, after the scapegoat mechanism happened, puts more and more emphasis on the positive transference of the peace that came out of the scapegoat mechanism, is like a fur. You know, the nice side of a fur. Where it's smooth and nice, and you don't see the bloody side of the skin of the animal skin. But the Bible, by siding with the victims, cries out the unjustified persecution and violence out into the world. So it shows you the bloody side of the violence that the myth covers up. Therefore, it's not a justification of violence. It's bringing violence out into the open in order that we can understand what happened in persecutions of people. So it doesn't cover up the violence. Yeah.
This is a pretty counterintuitive way of thinking about the Bible, or at least countercultural way of dealing with the Bible, because it seems that as a Protestant, a lot of the questions that I get about the Bible are questions like, well, the God of the Old Testament is just a violent God. It's this kind of Marcion Knight view of the Bible. The God of the Old Testament is a violent God, and the God of Jesus is a nice, loving God. And so many problems with that I'd like to talk through with you, including anti-Semitism of an idea like that. And how does Memetic theory help us deal with that issue?
I think a good example to address that question is the prevented sacrifice of Isaac by his father Abraham. I mean, I also know church-going people who are really, whenever this passage is read in the church, are completely confused and puzzled and said, I mean, how can a God demand from his father to kill his own son? Yeah. And I think the problem with such a passage is that we read it with modern eyes, with our modern understanding. And if we read this text with a modern understanding, it's really outrageous, and the new atheists are justified to say, this text, the Bible, all those things should be prohibited all over the world. But the important thing is to read these texts from the perspective of the emergence of these two types of religion we talked about before. So if you understand the early sacred, the sacred as it emerged in the beginning of human civilization, it was highly likable that a father would sacrifice his firstborn son. So sacrifices of firstborn sons, firstborn animals are a pattern that we can find in many cultures, and sometimes even still going on today. So we have to understand the logic and the thinking of this type of religious attitude, and then realize that the revolutionary aspect and the really extraordinary thing in this text about Isaac not sacrificed by his father is that suddenly an angel interrupts the whole thing and stops the sacrifice that was in that culture not something unusual. So we have to understand why sacrifice, which is a ritual repetition of the scapegoat mechanism in order to strengthen the peaceful side of the scapegoat mechanism. And so the people repeated that. I mean, we have this phenomenon of building sacrifices that we can discover all over the world, that in many cultures it was seen that if you build a big building or a dam or a bridge or other important building, you need a sacrifice in the foundation, because that will really prevent this building from breaking down and so on. And of course, we do not understand as modern people this attitude, but mimetic theory can help us to understand and then see why the biblical prophetical struggle against child sacrifice was such an important revolutionary thing. And in my book, the chapter on the Bible, I introduce with a very interesting quote by the German Nobel Prize winner and writer Thomas Mann, who was struggling with these issues over many, many years. First, there was a time in between the First and Second World War when scholars and people got attracted by new discoveries of mythology. So suddenly many people were attracted and thought it's very interesting, and these were lively cultures and so on. So he wrote a four-volume novel on Joseph and his brothers. And if you read the first novel, you have also again a lot of child sacrifices described more than in the Bible. And he was fascinating by this age-old strange culture. But at the same time, you know, National Socialism was endangering the world more and more. And Thomas Mann had to flee to the United States. And in the later stage, so the later part of this novel is really a critique of, and also the later work of this mythological thinking. And in the 42, 43, I do not recall now the exact date, he gave a lecture in the Congress Library in Washington, where he describes a little bit his own work on the Joseph story, these novels, and how this relates to National Socialism. And he refers to this passage of Abraham and Isaac and said, the real revolution that happened in this text is that the son was spared and substituted by an animal. And this was a revolution, he said, a revolution how God tried to bring people out of the old pattern and move beyond human sacrifices. I think it's a tremendous insight, especially because he also related it to the struggle in the 20th century with National Socialism, where some of the elements of the early sacred now came again in a very dangerous modern form into politics and global affairs.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking about the sacrifice or the near sacrifice of Isaac and how God stops the child sacrifice from happening is also crucial in understanding Jesus and the sacrifice of Jesus. And one of the things that mimetic theory has been so helpful for me is helping me to unlearn a lot of popular theology, or a lot of the theology that says that God demanded the sacrifice of God's son and sacrificed Jesus up on the cross. Can you talk about Gerard and mimetic theory and how mimetic theory helps us understand what's happening on the cross?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question, and also a question that has now led to many articles and book chapters, because it was so important for Gerard to distinguish Jesus' death on the cross from the sacrifice coming out of the scapegoat mechanism typical of early religions. So he wanted to clearly separate those two things, so that in things hidden since the foundation of the world and even later, he avoided the term sacrifice for Jesus. And he emphasized all the passages in the New Testament where you can say this has nothing to do with sacrifice. But there are other passages in it where the term sacrifice is used. So it was the influence of the Innsbruck Jesuit theologian Raimund Schwager, who from the very beginning worked very closely with Schwager. So both of them used mimetic theory in regard to the Bible at the same time. So 1978, both published their books that used insights of mimetic theory to interpret the Bible. Gerard, Things Hidden, and Schwager, Must Be Scapegoats. And they had a intense letter exchange where they discussed about the things. And Schwager, as a theologian, said we should not easily avoid the term sacrifice. And it was 1995 when I, with my colleague Josef Niewiadomski, published a Festschrift for Schwager. We invited Gerard to contribute. And in this contribution, for the first time, he made very clearly a change of his position. He said we should not avoid the term sacrifice for the crucifixion, but should emphasize on the different meaning. So he still insists on the difference, but the danger of avoiding the term sacrifice in the case of Jesus is the danger to neglect the violence that was involved also in this case. And when I teach this topic to students, I always refer to the unofficial anti-Vietnam and peace movement hymn in the United States, John Lennon's Imagine. And this is a famous song with a lot of things to address and discuss in regard to theology. But for this topic now, for this question now, one line is very important. And this line says, nothing to kill or die for, nothing to kill or die for. And of course, when I teach these courses, I spend sometimes 30, 45 minutes with my students and let them listen to the song and let them read the text and say, what are all the elements and insights of Lennon you agree with? And they discover a lot, and it's justified. And of course, we all know a world in which nobody is forced to kill, or a world in which nobody is forced to die for something. I mean, like patriotism, nationalism, for religious communities, people were killed and people died by killing others. So to overcome those patterns is very important. But as long as we are in a world in which conflicts between human beings, violence emerges, there could be the critical, exceptional case, but significant case, that you can avoid killing others only by giving yourself your life. So by saying, I dream of a world where nothing to kill and die for, avoids the critical situation. What do you do in a situation where you have to choose between the two? And this choice, that there are circumstances where you have to give your life in order to save life, this is, I think, a very important element to understand Jesus' death on the cross, or to understand a life of a person like Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi, or many other people who engaged in non-violence and struggled non-violently to overcome persecution, social injustice, and sometimes were killed by their fight against violence. And I would also understand Jesus' life and his teachings as a life and teaching of non-violence. And when he was forced to choose between violence, I mean, there is this passage where he says himself, he could have probably, as being the Son of God, brought many violent elements in the world to overcome that, but that would contradict completely his message in the Sermon on the Mount. So he was killed as a consequence of his absolute engagement for a life of social justice and a life avoiding violence. And so the later Girard understood that to avoid the term sacrifice might be the problem that this one line in the song Imagine also causes in some way, that you are blind for those cases where you cannot avoid the one if you want to avoid the other. You cannot avoid dying if you really are committed to not killing.
Mm.
Maybe you are aware, there's a famous Austrian farmer who was married, had 3 children, and he resisted to fight for Hitler's army. And he was killed by the Nazis for resisting to do his military service. And it took a very long time until Austrian people agreed and saw him as a saintly man. Now he's not a saint, but what is the stage before sainthood in English? A blessed. So he's on the quite high up on the move to become a saint and recognized by the Catholic Church. But many people didn't understand that and said, how can he, as a father of young girls, let him be killed by the Nazis? But for him, the question was, and he was a very simple man, but with a deep spiritual insight, when you read his letters and his notes, that he really understood better than many professors and highly sophisticated people what the whole Nazi ideology and policy was all about. And he said, if I want to be following the biblical message, I cannot become a soldier in Hitler's army. And the consequence was he had to die. And so therefore we should not avoid focusing also on these difficult questions, and that lead us to a better understanding of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross than all the traditional readings that saw him as a offer to God for cleaning God of human misconduct and failure and so on, which is a very strange theology that is much closer to the early religions and not to the biblical legacy.
I was just going to ask you about that, because the God that's so often depicted on the cross, who demands Jesus to sacrifice, is a God that's connected with wrath.
Right.
And so it's often said that, yes, God is love, but God is also wrath. Or God is love, but God is also judgment. And by judgment, the idea is God's going to be wrathful at you because God judges you as sinful and angry, unless God can channel all of that wrath against an innocent victim, Jesus. That sounds, as you were describing early religions and the double transference, exactly
Right.
what the early religions were doing.
So you have the double-faced and ambiguous God of early religions, and not the Father of Jesus, as Jesus describes him in his sermons and sayings and.
Yeah, and as the letter First John says, God is love, right? So God is
in God. And God is light and no shadow in him. And if you compare it with the theology of Aeschylus, for instance, then you have again and again always this ambiguous, double-faced understanding of the divine being.
Yes.
That's the early religious projection coming from human beings.
Yes. One of the big debates in Memetic theory is, you alluded to it earlier, Gerard's almost emphasis on the superiority of Christianity. But what role do you see other religions playing in either in Memetic theory or helping to illuminate us? I mean, you've talked about detachment quite a bit, which led me to think about Buddhism. So where do you see other religions in this conversation?
I mean, I had once a conversation with Gerard on this issue, and I emphasized a little bit, if mimetic theory is a universal anthropology, it would be, we couldn't understand why some of the important insights would not be observable in all the religions and cultures. So, I mean, of course, as a Christian, I'm myself a Christian, and Gerard was a Christian converted later in his life. The message of Jesus, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, help us a lot to understand our own religion and our own world and our own life better. And I think this is very good. But this doesn't mean automatically that all other religious ways are wrong or that we can easily judge on that. And I myself started for a couple of years quite eagerly Islam, and I found a lot of parallels in Islamic writings and understandings. And of course, I would very strongly insist that the most important insights of the Judeo-Christian legacy, the overcoming of human sacrifice, the overcoming of early religions, the emphasis on social justice, the emphasis on the innocence of persecuted people, you find in the Quran as well as in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And we talked quite at length about Abraham not sacrificing his son. This key story is in the Quran. And whenever Gerard tried to illustrate the difference of the Bible over against myth, he most of the time compared Edibus Myth with the Joseph story of the Hebrew Bible. And it's absolutely fascinating that the Joseph story is one of those biblical stories that has a huge presence also in the Quran. So if you would say the Joseph story is a keystone to understand this outside now the passion of Christ, what the biblical difference is, then you clearly see that that the Quran is part of this Abrahamic legacy. And I would even go a step further by looking at Eastern religions, and for the last couple of years, and I will do it next spring in a research group for 5 months, by focusing on Mahatma Gandhi.
Mm.
And I started already last couple of years Gandhi's work. And Gandhi was for me also a very helpful tool to approach Islam, because after 9/11, I felt, can I say something about terrorism, religion, violence, Islam, the whole discussion? I mean, I started Gerard and all those things for more than 20 years. And now 9/11 happened. And in the first moment, I felt I cannot say anything or not a lot. And then I started to read Gandhi, because Gandhi, of course, in this multi-religious Indian world, had a lot of contacts with Christians, with Muslims and so on. So I read Gandhi, and it helped me a lot also to open my eyes for Islam. And by reading Gandhi, I felt especially a lot of parallels to Gerardian insights in the City Science, the novel. So detachment, and the most famous thing that I would like to share now is a verse from the Isha Upanishads.
Mm.
So Gandhi, I mean, Gandhi was an eager reader of the Sermon on the Mount, and I just published a German article on that, showing that the way Protestants and Catholics today read the Sermon on the Mount is impossible without Gandhi, because early Christian, or for a very long time, with few exceptions like Francis of Assisi, they understood the Sermon on the Mount as a Christian passivity. But Gandhi emphasized very strongly the active role of Jesus, the active nonviolent engagement. And so when we today read the Sermon on the Mount the way most of the scholars read it, you see that there is Gandhi behind. So he was reading the Sermon on the Mount, he was reading the Quran, he was reading the biography of Muhammad. He was, every second week, he was reading the Bhagavad Gita. He read it in a very special way, but also was deeply convinced that also the Bhagavad Gita is a strengthening of his understanding of nonviolence. But for simple people who were not able to read, when he gave prayer meetings and little sermons or talks at prayer meetings, he only used a verse from the Isha Upanishad. And this is the first verse of the Isha Upanishad, and it goes like that: all this, whatsoever moves on earth, is to be hidden in the Lord. When thou hast surrendered all this, then thou mayest enjoy. Do not covet the wealth of any man. So if you read that very carefully, for me, this is a short version of the 10 Commandments. It's a short version of the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments is a very helpful tool also to highlight mimetic theory, because the end of the 10th commandment says, do not covet the wife, the donkey, the slave. Everything what the other has is so attractive for all of us. Again, a deep anthropological insight. So the 10th commandment summarizes the most dangerous mimetic entanglements we can be caught up. And Gerard powerfully explains that all the other commandments down to the commandment not to kill are in some way possible consequences if we do not keep the 10th commandment. But what's even more important, I mean, I developed it a little bit further, that I say the first commandment, it's again what I said in our first talk, or the second talk, about the summum bonum, about the highest good. You can only avoid the temptations addressed in the 10th commandment if you orient your desires towards those goods that do not devise us. So in the first 3 commandments in the 10 commandments is a strong emphasis to orient ourselves towards God. So to orient our desire towards God. And the more we fulfill this first table of the 10 commandments, the more likely it will be that we are able to keep the 10th commandment and do not fall in the dangerous corruptions and perversions and dangers of the other commandments. So if you read this verse of Gandhi, it says the same in some way. It says, give yourself completely over to God. This means then also detachment, but not in the sense you give up desire, but you orient your desire in a positive way. And then it says, when you do that, when you are in a detached mode, you can enjoy, because if you are not detached, you cannot enjoy anything. And it's also in the first letter to the Corinthians, you have the same, use the world as if you don't use the world. Use your money or everything as if you have no money, or if you are not attached to any kind of money. And the last line, do not covet the wealth of any man, addresses, like the 10th commandment, this danger of mimetic rivalry. So when I see this parallel, I am just struck that in those, that there is a deep religious wisdom in all our religions that address exactly those key elements of mimetic theory. And we should not be surprised, because if mimetic theory is not just one theory, but really is a profound anthropology that addresses the basic questions we human beings face, it should be addressed in all the traditions of wisdom and spirituality and religion. And the more I worked in that direction, the more I found proof for that, which does not mean that I would now diminish all the differences between religion or that I give up my Christian faith. It just, I mean, understanding that in Gandhi's work confirms my understanding of the 10 Commandments even stronger. I understand now the 10 Commandments better than before I dealt with those insights of Mahatma Gandhi.
And I say thank God for that. Wherever truth shows up, thank God. Thank God that it's there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Wolfgang, thank you so much for these conversations and spending this time with us. It's been a joy for me, and it's always good to see you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.